Welcome back, everybody, to Two Guys and a Stack of Comics. My name is Reed, running solo yet again. Mike is a little busy still, but wanted to talk a little bit today about what should be the biggest event in comics, which should be the best comic book coming out. That is Batman Hush 2, the long-awaited sequel. You get Jeff Loeb, a classic Batman writer who has written so many great Batman works as far as The Long Halloween, Dark Victory, the original Hush storyline, even A Haunted Night, which is an underrated one from him and Tim Sale. You have Jim Lee, perhaps the greatest Batman artist of all time, arguable with Neil Adams, but certainly the greatest of the modern era of Batman, and certainly one of the most famous artists in all of comics. And yet, Hush 2, the sequel to probably one of the most notable Batman stories of all time, is slowly becoming an absolute disaster for DC Comics. And so, that was just to talk a little bit about how all of this is going wrong, why I think a lot of this has gone wrong, and how much of a black mark I think this is for DC, in that I think DC All In has been going really well for DC Comics. They launch some great initiatives. The Absolute Universe, whether you love it or not, and I'm kind of mixed on it. I've stuck with 4 of the series. Green Lantern lost me, but the other 4 I'm still kind of circling with, and kind of different enjoyment levels with them, but they're selling incredibly well. You've had stuff like Jeremy Adams' Aquaman, which really seems to have brought that character back and given him an intriguing story. New books like The New Gods from Ram V have been doing really well. And in the Batman sphere of things, it's been interesting in that, Batman and Robin with Philip Kennedy Johnson's been doing really great. You've had, the Mark Waid and Chris Samney, Batman and Robin Year One that's doing well. You have a lot of great books with Batman coming out right now. And yet the main title is in a lot of trouble despite the fact that it probably has the big name talents on it. Now, from a sales standpoint, Hush 2 is an absolute success. Every time an issue comes out, seems to sell out fairly quickly and is doing great for that. So I'm sure DC is happy in terms of a sales thing. But from a story structure standpoint, and now from an actual logistical standpoint, Hush 2 is going to start causing some major issues for Batman. So we talk a little bit about why this happened, how it's inexcusable that it happened, and just, again, why I think this is kind of a black mark for DC Comics. So first and foremost, look, there's no more important character to DC than Batman, and the main flagship Batman title is the most important book. And if you kind of track how Hush 2 came to be, there was whispers about it last year. Chip Zdarsky was still on the main title. I was not a huge fan of Chip Zdarsky's run. I thought it started great, and then it really fell off. But they sort of rushed him off the title. It seemed like he had a year left, and then all of a sudden, there were rumors that Jim Lee was working on stories, and then his kind of wrapped up really fast with 6 issues. Very an unnotable send-off for Zdarsky, for someone who had a pretty long run, about 3 years on the title. And so the idea was they were giving him kind of a runway to let Jim Lee, we were told, as fans, hey, Jim Lee's catching up, they're putting issues ahead. And yet here we are 50% of the way through the story, and we are already hit with major delays on Batman. As issue 160 came out about 3 weeks ago, issue 161 has now been delayed. I think it's almost a month delay that this is going to get, which is part 4 of 6. And then when you look at the fact that issues 5 and 6 of this title have now been delayed 2 months each, meaning that the final issue of this will come out on October the 29th. Now, I am not a huge opponent of moving on from books because an artist is slow. Mike and I have talked a lot about how we as fans would probably wait for the same creative team to get the job done. However, in a 6-issue story, it is a little bothersome that that's already not even halfway through the story being hit with major delays, especially because we know there was a lot of lead-up time to this. I think the other major concern with this is because of the nature of solicitations and DC Comics trying to get ahead of things, they announced that Matt Fraction with Jorge Jimenez was going to launch a brand new Batman #1, which was supposed to build off of the events of Hush, because this is the current mainline Batman title. It was supposed to wrap with issue 163 and then have a new #1 launch. Well, that new #1 launch is set to come out in September, and today DC Comics seemed to confirm that will still launch. So the ridiculous portion of this is that you will now have the relaunched, rebooted Batman #1 that will release almost 2 months before the other series actually wraps up. In addition, DC Comics also announced a Red Hood ongoing that will take place. It's a mature book, but it is going to be set in the DC continuity. But this is actually going to relaunch around September as well. Red Hood has been a major player in this Hush story, and now the finale of that will seemingly launch before this. And so you kind of have where this delays has not only undercut this story, which will now be 6 issues spread across almost an entire year, but you also have the fact that now 2 series that were reliant upon the ending of this will both launch beforehand. And it kind of gives major spoilers away that characters will survive. Not that you anticipated like Jason Todd dying. But one of the interesting things out of this was Jeff Loeb was talking about how he was going to fix the Robin problem that took place in DC Comics with too many Robins. Now we know, well, nothing's going to happen to Jason Todd because we have this other book solicited and we won't see the finale of this event until well after. And so it's such a crazy thing from a logistical standpoint how this fell apart. And this is again such an issue with DC. And that this is not even the full Hush story. This is supposed to be 12 issues with the second 6 issues coming at the end of 2026. So now, instead of us getting this wrapped up and then a relaunch, we now have part 1 here and then a relaunch that will start before this is wrapped up, and then another one that will happen next year. And who knows, probably can already anticipate that will be delayed as well. And for me as a Batman fan, I think the big problem with this is the mistake was putting this in the main continuity. In that I understand and I actually respect the heck out of the fact that they wanted to put it in the main continuity. That was a huge appeal of the original Hush, as it was just part of the regular number in the Batman. I thought that was a great idea when they did it, and I thought this was a good idea that you were just going to have the main book. However, now that you have a relaunch starting, it just is increasingly apparent that with Jim Lee being the main artist, he was never going to be able to keep up with a monthly comic book scheduling. And so this should have been a miniseries, especially because of the nature of the story. And that's another huge issue that's happened with Hush 2 is not only logistically has this undercut, I think, a little bit of the #1 relaunch, undercut a little bit of the Red Hood story, and massively undercut this story. But you now have that we'll have a back half issue, six more issues, probably a year and a half from now. And so the whole thing is, had this been a mini series or a limited series, it would have worked a lot better because from a story standpoint, this has also been a disaster, which is shocking. And that I would say Jeff Loeb is probably my favorite modern comic book writer. When you look at his Batman work, stuff like Daredevil Yellow, Spider-Man Blue, Hulk Gray, he's been great with multiple properties, multiple companies. He's done such a great job, most notably with Tim Sale, but also on the original Hush with Jim Lee. And sadly, what's happened is because they put this in the main continuity, unlike the first Hush, that while, yes, a little different than what was going on in the Batman title beforehand, it put Batman in kind of a classical place enough that you could fit it well within continuity. Nothing really seemed different. The interesting thing with this is because Hush has not been a major factor in Batman's life in a long time, this story sort of took the idea of Hush 1 and just kind of acted like that was recent when it was 20 years ago. And so the weirdest part that this story has had is from the first issue of this, there's been this almost like end game type of feel behind it, but there was no build up to it. And the interesting thing is you have, 3 issues in, you're only about 60 pages stories wise in. Batman's acting very unhinged. He's acting completely confused. He's acting like Hush is this all oppressive threat. And he's really off of his game, but nothing's happened in the story to justify that. And again, if this was a direct sequel to Hush published as like a mini series, picking up directly after those events, that would make sense. And then if you go back to the original Hush where Batman was, at the very end, he finds out the revelation that it's his former friend. You have Harvey Dent being redeemed at the end of that story. You had Batman being betrayed by Harold at the end of that story. You had him suspecting that Catwoman had betrayed him. Those elements, all that were left at the end of that story, would make sense with a Batman who's a little off of kilter and kind of feels like Hush is this massive threat. But when you put this into the continuity that we have now, where it's been a good 20 years since Hush has really been a factor, there were some interesting like Paul Dini stories and things with him. But overall, it felt so escalated so quickly. Everybody's acting out of character to the point that you had Batman shoot a gun at Jason Todd. And yes, the book was very clear, that he was trying to, not wound him, but like kind of break his mask a little bit. He wasn't trying to hurt him. Again, to have that out of character of a moment for Batman, it's just shocking. So the weird part is the Jeff Loeb writing has really been the disappointing, which is part of this, which is shocking because I can't recall a time that that's been happening, especially because Jeff Loeb is currently writing another Batman book, the final two, the Long Halloween, the last Halloween. That's great and is in character. So the interesting thing is, this has become a lot like the Wolverine's revenge story that was happening at Marvel Comics, where the Greg Capullo art was fantastic, but the story was just absolutely ludicrous. And you're seeing this happen here. And yes, we're 50% of the way through. It could certainly turn around. But you have this weird sort of balance that's happening now where this seemed like a forced event to try to capitalize on Hush, but they didn't directly tie it to it. They wanted the modern continuity, but they didn't want to embrace what was in the modern continuity. They wanted those events to seem very recent, but it's been a long time since Hush has been a factor. And so you're getting all the negatives and drawbacks of a sequel to something if you were just reading the main Batman title. But you're not getting any of the benefits of it actually being a sequel to it because they're still trying to drag modern stuff into it. Overall, it's just such a poorly executed idea from DC. And it's really shocking to see this happen because these are two premier talents on a premier book. This needed more time to develop. This needed to be a better story. But sadly, DC just doesn't seem to have been able to fix this. And now it's going to cause problems down the line. And I think this is a major issue for comic books across the board. And I think this is why, as fans, we get flustered with this stuff. This is such an easily fixable problem. There are plenty of people who want to work on the main Batman title. Batman's title sells pretty good. They could have very easily just waited until Jim Lee was done with the 6 issues before they ever launched it. They already was a huge delay. You were already going with Zdarsky. You could have done a fill-in arc. You could have let Zdarsky go 6 more issues. You could have brought in a new writer. You could have launched the #1 with Matt Fraction and Jorge Jimenez. Let them get on their footing. Set Hush up. Maybe they could have used the first 6 issues of their series to set Hush up, establish him back in there, set up these consequences, and then have Jeff Loeb and Jim Lee come in. But again, it's just DC with too many people doing too many things at the same time. And now the fans are really the ones that are going to kind of pay for this, and that the story's already a little bit spoiled because we know people who survived because of other oncoming events. We're going to have to wait probably a full 2 years for this to actually finish. It's just shocking how disappointing this is, especially because it's the #1 property that DC has. This is the most important book that DC Comics has. It's the equivalent of the NFL Super Bowl, right? In the NFL, the Super Bowl is the most important event. They make sure that that is the best broadcast of the year. They put the best broadcasting teams, the best channels, the best presentation, the most money, because they know this is the event that anybody who has any interest in football is going to see. Batman is that book for DC Comics. It is the biggest book they have. It is a linchpin book that gets people into the store. Batman sales help the sales of every other comic book because there's a ton of people who go in just to buy Batman and end up grabbing Superman or Aquaman or even Marvel comics like X-Men simply because they were there for Batman. And when you have massive delays, an underwhelming story, undercutting the relaunch of a new #1, where now the issues are even out of sync, it's just an absolute disaster on every level. And it's just truly shocking that DC Comics would let that happen. But just one man's opinion. Let me know what you guys think down below. Why do you think Hush 2 has gone so wrong? Do you think it was forced? Do you think this would have been better as a mini series? Or if they had just given it a little more time to cook and reestablish Hush rather than just tossing you back in and acting like all of this has been building for years when it really hasn't? As always, folks, thank you for watching. God bless you. We'll catch you in our next video.